Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Ahmad, and today we're going to start a new chapter in the neuroanatomy. And this one is basically the diencephalon, and we're going to discuss the multiple aspects or the multiple anatomic structure related to the diencephalon. Now we have ventured into the a relatively drier topics of the neuroanatomy. So the first one we're going to discuss is the thalamus. So let's look at the brief overview for the diencephalon. It is a caudal aspect of the prosencephalon, which is a forebrain, and it occupies the central region of the brain, and it consists of thalamus, hypothalamus, epithalamus, subthalamus, and metathalamus. In this presentation, we're going to discuss the thalamus. In the consequent presentations, we're going to discuss the hypothalamus and further. So it functions as a processing center of the brain, and it relays the sensory information and regulates the autonomic control. So thalamus. So the thalamus is a large ovate structure which is 4 centimeter in length, and it is present in the dorsal part of the diencephalon. It is a bilateral structure. So it has two identical halves, and they are called thalami, and both of these halves are connected with the interthalamic adhesions, and these adhesions are not made up of any neurons, but they are made up of glial cells. And it has a several interconnected nuclei of gray matter which are separated by the laminae, and it acts as a gate to the consciousness, which means that it is a main conductor of the information that passes between the body and the cerebral cortex, and that include the periphery, spinal cord, brainstem, and it is divided into anterior, medial, and lateral parts. The main functions of the thalamus includes the participation in the regulation and maintenance of the consciousness, which include alertness, wakefulness, and then there's a balance with the sleep. Then thalamus is also working as a filtering of the sensory information for the selective presentation to the cerebral cortex. One of the functions that the thalamus does not put too much input is the olfaction. There is the input that exists, but it is not filtered or modified. It is much more related with the limbic system. I will discuss that in the later presentation. All other sensory stimuli, it undergoes the processing in the thalamus and prior to the transmission to the cortical centers, and it also acts as a modulation of the motor responses via the interconnection with the basal ganglia as well. So thalamus has multiple nuclei, and these nuclei are basically the cell bodies of the excitatory and inhibitory neurons. And the dendrites of these thalamic nuclei, they receive the sensory information from all over the body, then it filter it, and it present to the cortex through the different connections, and these connections are called the thalamocortical radiations. These connections also include the connections with the fornix, hippocampus, limbic system, and mammillary bodies. And these thalamus or the gray matter nuclei are basically neuronal cell bodies, which is divided by the white matter laminae. The lateral surface has the external medullary laminae, while the internal laminae are basically dividing the thalamic nuclei into separate groups. So these are all multiple different nuclei that are present in thalamus. So you can see how much function it actually accomplish. We have the anterior nuclei. Now in neuroanatomy, not only there is anterior, posterior, inferior, superior, we also have the ventral aspects, dorsal aspects, and then of course we have the medial and lateral aspects. So here we have anterior nuclei. The ventral side has three nuclei: posterior medial, posterior lateral, and antiventral anterior and lateral nuclei. Now, why is it important with all these aspects is because the fibers or the neurons that are coming to these nuclei, it's going to go to the adjacent structure nearby. So you have to have a good knowledge of the cerebral cortex, which I discussed in the previous slides as well. We have a dorsomedial nuclei, we have a pulvinar, medial geniculate body, lateral geniculate body, intralaminar midline nuclei as well. So let's start with all these nucleuses. There's a lot of information that is stored all over the place, but I have tried to concise all that information here in one slide. So you have the major information that you need. So anterior nucleus has the three subdivisions: anterior ventral, anterior medial, and anterior dorsal. So it gets the input from the mammillary bodies, hippocampal formation, and limbic system. Output is to the cingulate gyrus in the cerebral cortex, and then it function as a learning memory emotions, and it also have effect on the limbic pathway. So you look down here, I have a lateral aspect of the thalamus, one half, and you see the anterior nucleus right here. It's like relatively bigger nucleus, and I have zoomed it out for you. The next one, we have a ventral posterior medial nucleus. Again, it has a trigeminothalamic tract, so it's getting the information, a sensory information, you must say, from the face and oral cavity. And it has a rostral solitary nucleus, which is getting a gustatory information. What is gustation? Gustation is basically taste. So getting that information from there. So whenever you taste your food, rest assured that the rostral solitary nucleus is involved in it. So this is the input that it's getting. Where is outputting it to? So it's putting it out to the primary somatosensory cortex, and number two, gustatory cortex, which is present in the frontal operculum and insula. And function relays somatosensory cranial nerve inputs, trigeminal of course, touch, pain, position, and temperature from the face, and relay the gustation taste to the cortex. Again, there's the half of the thalamus, and we have the ventral posterior medial nucleus right there. The next one is the ventral posterior lateral nucleus. It's getting same sensory information, but this time it is getting from the body and the limbs. And how? Through the dorsal column, medial lemniscus, pressure, and what type of information it is getting? It is getting pressure, vibration, fine touch, and proprioception. And it's also getting information from spinothalamic tract, which is from lateral for pain and temperature, anterior for crude touch and pressure. So spinothalamic tract, the lateral aspect is for the pain and temperature, and the anterior aspect is for crude touch and pressure. And where it is outputting the information to, so once again, somatosensory cortex. So this is for the perception of the sensation, touch, vibration, pain, and temperature. But this one is from the body and the limbs, the face, and the gustation is the other one, posterior medial nucleus, but this one is the posterior lateral. The function for the ventral posterior lateral nucleus is that it relays the somatosensory spinal inputs to the somatosensory cortex. Next, we have the ventral anterior nucleus. So the input is from the basal ganglia, output is to the frontal lobe, to the motor, premotor, and supplemental motor cortices. And the function is it relays basal ganglia inputs to the motor cortices to the for motor planning. Important. Then we have the ventral lateral nucleus, and this one is getting input from the cerebellum. And again, it is sending that information out to the frontal lobe, to the motor, premotor, and supplemental motor cortices. It functions as a relay center for the cerebellar inputs to the motor cortices of the motor planning and control. Again, if you would like, please go ahead and look at these slides that I have made for the cerebral cortex. It's a two-part series as well. Next one we have is a dorsomedial nucleus. It has the input from the amygdala, olfactory, and limbic basal ganglia, and it has an output to the frontal cortex and the prefrontal association areas. And functions include emotions, cognition, and learning. And the lesion present here will contribute to the pathogenesis of the Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome. Again, pulvinar is one of the important nucleus that is present, and it has a three primary subdivisions: medial, lateral, and inferior. And the input is from the visual inputs from the superior colliculus and extrastriate visual areas. Another input is from the auditory, and then the other sensory pathway. And output is the parieto-temporal occipital association areas. Precise function is unknown, but it is believed to be involved in orientation towards visual, auditory, and other sensory stimuli. So again, after the anterior nucleus, pulvinar is one of the bigger nucleuses present in the thalamus. We have a medial geniculate body right here, and it is a part of the auditory pathway, and it's getting input from the inferior colliculus, and output is to the auditory cortex of the temporal lobe, and it function as a it relays the auditory input to the cortex. Then we have a lateral geniculate body. It is a main relay station of the visual pathway. It is organized in 6 layers. So layer 1 and 2 is consisting of the larger neuron, while layer 3 to 6, 3, 4, 5, 6, it consists of the smaller neurons. So it's getting input from the retina, optic nerve. Now divide those input into two different pathways. So contralateral nasal hemiretina projections are going to the layer 1, 4, and 6, while ipsilateral temporal hemiretina projections are going to the layer 2, 3, and 5. The output is to the primary visual cortex in the occipital lobe, and efferent fibers retain visuotopic layered organization as they project to the visual cortex. And their function, of course, is relaying visual inputs to the primary visual cortex, so it is important for vision. Lateral geniculate body right there. Now we have the final slide, and this one is the intralaminar and the midline nuclei. You look at one half of the thalamus. This is the this right here is the midline nuclei in the middle, and this is the intralaminar internal medullary lamina. Medullary lamina, as we discussed before, it is dividing the all these nucleuses into different groups. So intralaminar nuclei is present right here. These small little structures right there, and it is getting ascending reticular information. That's the input, spinal cord and hypothalamus, and the output is to the limbic cortex and basal ganglia. The function includes arousal, motivation, affect, and pain, and reticular activating system. With this slide, we're going to end our discussion with the thalamus, and I'll see you in the next slides for the hypothalamus. Thank you so much, and I'll see you soon.